Hi all, and welcome to part 3 of our 4-part webinar series, Learn to Fly with Juniper Networks. I'm Adam Hartley and I head up the technical team for Juniper Networks here at Westcoast. Just a little notice that if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to ask them as we go along and we'll pick them up at the very end. So today we have a packed agenda, but by the end of the webinar, you will understand today's security model, how Juniper are taking this to the next level. I'll also give you a look at Juniper's industry-leading software-defined secure network solution, where we can use the entire network as a security enforcement domain, introduce you to the Juniper team here at Westcoast as a whole, and then a little bit of Q&A at the end. So as this is part 3 of 4, I thought it'd be nice to go over and to recap the other 2 parts that were previous to this. And you can also find these on Westcoast's YouTube channel after this webinar as well. We should have this one up by the end of the week as well. So just to recap, in our first webinar, we covered how every organization has data that they can leverage to improve their security posture by adding additional layers of context to that data. With this additional context, we can leverage data insights to form what is normal on the network and take appropriate action when non-normal behavior is happening. In webinar 2, we covered Juniper's networking and security range and how to get your customers' true pain points out with great leading questions. We also covered objection handling and why Westcoast and Juniper beats the competition, which amazingly segues back into a recap of why Westcoast and Juniper are as a brilliant pair together. So the team here at Westcoast is the largest Juniper team in the UK and I for Juniper Networks. We at Westcoast are a large organization, but whilst being a large organization are quite agile and flexible and able to scale to your needs. Because we're a privately owned £1.9 billion organisation, so we're able to scale up and meet your requirements as and when. The big piece for Juniper Networks is that they're prepared to beat the competition, not just from a technology perspective, but also price. If we're up against any form of competition, we're prepared to be able to match, if not beat them, both from a Westcoast and a Juniper perspective too. So now let's get into today's webinar. So most customers today use and roll out this type of security model. This being everything outside the edge of the organization is untrusted, but when you get inside, you're trusted and not checked for security at all. This leads to massive headaches for IT teams and unanswered questions when trying to trace back what happened and the threats if they are spotted. So here we see a lot of today's always on and mobile workforce. So here we have a mobile worker who goes to a malicious website whilst at the airport and gets a malicious application installed in the background without the user knowing. So when the user gets back to the office and plugs into the LAN or connects to the Wi-Fi, and due to the trusted model we spoke about a few moments ago of today's organization, the threat spreads across the entirety of the organization, just like how we saw with the Petra and WannaCry pieces of ransomware earlier this year. The way forward from this outdated model of security is more of an untrusted model where every piece of the network is inspected and not allowed to talk to anyone until it passes those checks each and every time. So how do we do that, I hear you ask? Oh, well, luckily I've got an answer for that. Well, with Juniper Networks, not only do we use this updated model of untrusted, we can actually go way beyond that and leverage the network itself to enforce these security policies if broken. So if we break this down a bit, we can separate this into 3 main pieces. policy, detection, and enforcement. With Juniper, you can manage and create policies in a single management piece and do so in natural language, so no needing to actually know the coding language for it. You can actually do it in plain English, and no need to constantly upskill on updates to the operating system that runs it. We can also manage and publish policy to every device in your estate across multiple sites and in the cloud. So it's not like you need a management plane in each and every other site and one in the cloud. You just need one and being able to push that across. Next, we move to detection, where Juniper can leverage OEM agreements with Sophos and WebSense, as well as its own threat data and cloud-based advanced threat prevention solution to offer you the best-in-class protection with multiple detection sources. You can also import your own, say that you have a Zoom solution or other vendors in place. You can also put those threat feeds into Juniper to strengthen it further. From there, we go to enforcement, and I'll explain that in a few more slides, so no need to duplicate work. So Juniper's mentality is that any network asset, regardless of where it sits in the estate, from any vendor, should integrate with each other and lead to a secure network. I know that that's a big statement, but that's actually what Juniper's mentality is, and hopefully you'll get to understand that as we go along. And this is what that idea looks like in a Juniper world, where your Wi-Fi and your network access control from, say, Aruba talks to the network and shares data, and so does your endpoint protection from, say, Carbon Black. This leads to a shared threat intelligence greater than all the sum of its parts, but can actually lead to a unified solution where everything can talk to each other via open standards. And I'll talk to you a bit later about the open standards that Juniper uses. So this is the functionality from a out-of-the-box Juniper solution. So from the far left, we've got what you'd actually class as normal within a next-generation firewall solution, which is intrusion prevention, user-based firewall, antivirus, anti-spam, and web filtering. You'd expect that from most next-generation firewall vendors, and if they don't have that, then they're typically not bought. But what Juniper goes to and goes way beyond is this threat intelligence platform, which sits on Box and with our management plane security director, as well as our advanced threat prevention, which Juniper calls Sky ATP. But I'll talk to that a bit later. So to provide these next generation firewall and unified threat management services to your users, here is a standard Juniper network technology stack. Here we have a Juniper firewall. You can either have that as a physical firewall, which is the SRX range, or a virtual VSRX firewall. We also have our switches, the EX range, and the QFX range, which is our top of rack solution. We also have the MX range, which is Juniper's enterprise router range. And because Juniper works on open standards, we can work with other third-party elements as well. As I said before, with Carbon Black or with Aruba, we can even interoperate with Cisco as well, and other vendors go on, and now I'll speak a bit more on the Cisco integration in a few more slides. And that's basically what it looks like. So from a normal next generation firewall feature set, is that threats coming in to the organization are stopped before it enters the organization, and compromised devices can't talk out. And that's what you'd expect from virtually any next generation firewall vendor. So next we're going to address, okay, so if that's what is standard in the world of cybersecurity and when it comes to firewalls and networking, how are we going to move beyond that, and what are the next steps? And why isn't this good enough, and where can we go from here? So over the past 3 years, we've seen cybersecurity threats explode in numbers, but not only just in the number of new threats, but also in sophistication. We're now seeing cybercrime generate almost as much as the UK's GDP each year, and they're actually estimating it to go over the UK's GDP in 2018, actually, which is quite scary to think that this has become an industry in its own, which makes billions, trillions by 2020. So it's quite an interesting thing to follow if you've been in the industry for quite a few years. So due to this, organizations' security mentality had changed dramatically with it. So today's network is bombarded every minute with threats from too many threat vectors. It's only a matter of time before your customers is next. So that was a big statement to make, that it's going to be your customer that's most probably going to be next. And here's why. If you just have a next generation firewall and UTM functionality, that takes you up to that antivirus solution just here, this little dark blue bit here. If you deploy an advanced persistent threat solution, that takes you up to the light blue bit, which takes you into a little bit of the persistent threats where they try and reinstall themselves every time. But they don't pick up everything, because we've seen over the latter part of 2016 and most of this year that we're seeing quite evasive threats where they try to avoid detection. And that's where Juniper, with their solution, actually comes into its own, and I'll explain that over the next few slides. So if we start to look into how we get to understand these evasive threats, then we can work on actually detecting them. So from antivirus signatures, so that's basically understanding what is known and what is good and what is bad from that known. But it's not about the stuff that we know, it's about the stuff that we don't know, the unknowns. So that's what we're going to go into over the next few slides, is actually how do we determine this unknown stuff that the antivirus solutions aren't picking up from a standard signature perspective. So this is how Juniper deep dives into the unknown. So passing down the chain and adding more detection methods as we go along to better the customer experience. Because if we already know it, or we don't need as much analysis on it to gain understanding of this unknown, we don't want to take 7 minutes for every file that passes through. If it's only going to take 5 seconds to gain an understanding, we want to do that and make the customer experience better. So what we're going to do here is that we go all the way through the lines of being able to make sure that we've seen it on the box, to then pass it through our OEM agreements with antivirus partners. One of them mentioned was Sophos. And then what we're going to do is pass it along to static analysis, which means that we look at the metadata of the file, the structure of it, and signs that it's suspicious. If it goes from that, it goes to dynamic analysis, which is passed off to our cloud-based sandbox engine, which actually prods and pokes it, as well as mimicking user behavior to then get analysis of that. But I'll speak to that in the next few slides. So Juniper's cloud engine is called Sky ATP, their advanced threat prevention piece. So when files are sent to it from an SRX, then it is executed in a sandbox environment, and as I said, poked and prodded to run. Ways to ensure that files are not evading detection is to run the simulated user actions like keystrokes, mouse movements, and there's quite a lot that happens in the background, so like being able to run scripts in the background, opening and closing documents, but I can't disclose all of that information, because if I did and there was a hacker paying attention to this webinar, they'd figure out how to navigate around Sky ATP, and that won't be good for all of our users. We're also able to do this on our virtual SRXs. So regardless of if it's a piece of tin that is connecting to Sky ATP from your headquarters, or if it's a virtual firewall in your data center or in the public cloud, say Azure or AWS or Google Cloud, we have you protected and all talking to each other. Now that was a bit of an info dump. So here's a pretty GIF that we've got from how Sky ATP's sandbox analyzed a file. The one that I've highlighted here is from last year, which was a Lockheed A strain back in, I think it was March 2016, when Sky ATP first saw it. So as we can see from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, as it progresses across, we've actually deemed it to be very malicious, obviously, because it's a piece of ransomware. So we showed you Juniper's hardware stack. So now we're going to expand that into Juniper's portfolio. So here is Juniper's security stack. Here we have our firewalls, our switches, our routers, our management piece, which is Security Director. On top of that, we also have our enforcement piece, which Juniper calls Policy Enforcer. And to top it all off, we have Juniper's Cloud Engine, Sky ATP, and if you've got other threat intel that you want to pass into Sky ATP, you can also do that from in there. And once again, we adhere to open standards and have very good technology partnerships. So all of your third-party kit could talk into this, say Aruba, Carbon Black, Cisco, etc. So why is this important? So let's use the example I started off with before. So we have a mobile worker which picks up a piece of malware and unknowingly is compromised through a website on a public Wi-Fi hotspot. As before, they went back to the office or VPN'd in remotely, and that malware laterally propagated across the entire network. However, if they had Juniper's security stack, this is what we'd see. The infected device will try and connect to the malicious command and control server, which is what most bad pieces of ransomware do, or highly sophisticated threats do. Upon this, the SRX will talk with Security Director, our management piece, and also talk to Security Director, which will take action upon that. We'll then talk from the management and Sky ATP, which is deemed as malicious, to our underlay pieces of kit, which then talk to the devices on the network, and then talk to the actual device itself to actually take it off of the network. Because we also track the IP and MAC address, we're actually able to keep it off of the network as well. So even if they were connected in via an RJ45 on a LAN switch, and they disconnected and plugged into a different part of the building, or went to a different site, or then decided to VPN in or change to the Wi-Fi, we're still able to keep them off of the network, both from an IP perspective, but even from a MAC address perspective. And just to clarify that Sky ATP works everywhere and anywhere. So even if your customers are a distributed enterprise or a school with multiple buildings, or if they're using a hybrid multi-cloud estate, Juniper has you covered. They'll all still speak to the Sky ATP, which is based on the cloud, and they can all speak to each other too. So we've covered a lot of theory, so let's get our hands dirty and let's have a look at it then. So what we're going to be looking at is the reporting that Juniper security stack gives you, as well as the ability to deep dive into this. So I haven't given a sacrifice to the demo gods, so I've wimped out a little bit and actually taken some screenshots, because it's the worst thing to be doing a webinar and then your demo environment doesn't work, so please forgive me. So because SkyATP looks at files, it also scans emails and their attachments. So as you can see, we show you a fair amount of detail. And if you want to dive into the analytics here of the files, you just click the file signature. We actually do give you a lot of information here, especially around the threat level that we gave the file out of 10, and whether or not you should be to actually look deeper into it. So if it's red, it's very high, all the way down to a green tick that it's clean. From an email perspective, we actually take a lot of information specifically for emails about who actually sent it and where it was destined for, as well as what actual type of file we deemed it to be in itself. So as you can see in the screenshot, they're all executables. So if we clicked on it and actually clicked the file signature bit on the previous slide, it would take us to this part of the GUI. It would have taken you to actually the general tab, but that's a bit boring. So I decided to show you a bit about the behavior analysis part. So this gives you a very good overview of why Juniper came to that verdict. It gives you a breakdown quite granularly of what behavior that SkyATP got of this file, and how SkyATP got to this verdict, and also gives you an indication of actually how malicious it can be. If we didn't have the ransomware bit there, would you care that it was persistent, for instance? We as Juniper highlight that as a malicious activity, but the fact that it's got ransomware actually highlights to us that this is actually very malicious. What we can also do from in here is that we can understand and report false positives. It does happen. It hasn't happened for a very long time for Juniper networks, but if you think that this is a false positive, you can report that to Juniper networks just at a click of a button. As you can see up there with the report false positives, you click that, you put in an email address, and it sends the false positive straight off to Juniper networks. So as I said to you before, that we would take a device off of the network if we actually saw this activity. So that's all great. And you may be thinking that you like Juniper's security stack that takes this automatic action on protecting the network. But the main question that I get at this part when speaking to customers and to partners is, okay, that's all great, but how do I allow them back on the network when I've gone in and fixed the threat? So what I've done here is gone into a specific host in my demo environment. I've put a piece of malware on there. And now I've gone and removed the threat, and now I want to bring it and introduce it back onto the network. All you've got to do is go onto the host. You can see that and select the investigation status that they can see under threat settings. Go to resolve-fixed, and then from there we'll put it back to how it was before we took the automatic action and put it back, say, on the same VLAN or within the same site structure, all that it was before. So all it is a 3-click process from actually going into Security Director. It's 3 clicks to get it back onto the network up and running. So through Juniper's security stack, not only do we offer better security than our competition, but also greater insight to enable faster resolutions of threats. What this also enables us to do is to be able to take action automatically, so that you're not waiting 2-3 weeks for a SOC team or for your IT team to actually realize that there's been a breach, or if there's actually been a threat actually on the network. So let's deep dive a little bit and recap. So everything I've spoken about falls under Juniper, under the Juniper network solution called software-defined secure networks. And this picture here basically sums it up, where we can use the entire network as a single enforcement domain. To simplify, today's network security is like having a bunch of security guards with no method of communication. Their only way is to run to each other and speak face to face. What I like to liken Juniper's SDSN approach to is that we actually put a walkie-talkie and tasers in the hands of the security team, but also to every employee in an organization. So it means that every person that works on the network has a role to play and can actually take action on a threat. So we do this by creating policies that we all normally do to be able to catch threats with detection and using the network to actually enforce the policy in real time. Usually takes between 2 and 3 seconds for security director and policy enforcement to take a device off the network. And these levels, and here are the levels at which this takes place. So remember that we started off with policy, detection, enforcement. So obviously we create policy within security director and enforce policy via policy enforcer. We're able to detect threats from our SRXs and VSRXs, which are our firewalls, which have our next generation firewall standard feature set. We can also detect extra unknown threats through the Juniper Cloud, which is Sky ATP, and our Spotlight Secure, which is a bunch of threat feeds that Juniper own and feed into Sky ATP. And then we can actually do the enforcement through our EX, QFX, and MX range PIN, as well as third-party elements. A really cool piece with this is Aruba Network's ClearPass, which the SRX and the security director and policy director, and policy enforcer talk to actually do this type of enforcement on a wireless LAN instead of taking the whole access point off, which a lot of our competition just does. So let's talk into specifics of how we actually enforce this policy. So we've got an endpoint here that's somehow brought in a malicious file onto it. It then tries to talk out to the internet, and it's connected to an EX switch, which then tries to communicate out onto the internet via an SRX or a VSRX. It hasn't passed our cache checks or our antivirus checks or our static analysis checks, so it's sent off to Sky ATP for further analysis. What's actually happened here is that Sky ATP has deemed it malicious and sent that information to security director, which then passes that information to take action to policy enforcer. Policy enforcer, because it's Juniper, pushes that directly to the EX and QFX switches, which then takes the device off of itself, as well as creating a notification to the admin team within security director to take action. So you heard me talking about open standards and how we integrate with third-party equipment. So the same thing here happens. It's just that we're using a Cisco switch. We can also do this within a hybrid environment with some EXs and QFXs, with some Cisco switches, some HP switches, some Aruba switches here. As long as you've got a Radius server that's acting as a 802.1x gateway, we're able to do this authentication on third-party kits. But it's the same process. It's just that we're able to work with other vendors too, which not a lot of our competition can do. So speaking about them in total, we actually have quite a large range of different third-party integrations. Our biggest and our longest one is with Aruba Networks. That one's been going on for about 20 years now as technology partners both ways. We've got a big OEM agreement and integration with IBM around their SIEM solution, as well as our own SIEM solution. They both work side and side to give you a lot better protection together, as well as Pulse Secure, which used to be a part of Juniper Networks, which they spun off. We also have a tight integration with them. So to summarize, not only are we the only vendor that can integrate with other vendors to strengthen your customers' security posture, we can extend that beyond the edge into the private and public clouds whilst offering industry-leading protection. So some plugging before we sign off. So the Juniper team here at Westcoast is extremely experienced. As I said before, that Westcoast is a large organization, but because we're a privately owned company, we can be as flexible and dynamic as you, our partners, need us to be. A great example of that is last month, my colleague David Siddle, who was running part 1 and part 2 of the webinar series with me, got a partner an account, credit, their order loaded and shipped in 6 hours, where our competition would have taken a lot longer, days, if not weeks. We're also always winning at Westcoast. So join the party with us, and hopefully we'll all win some classy money. So reach out to any of the team. So here we've got Ed, Michael, and David, who are all BDMs and sales specialists. You've got myself as the networking and security pre-sales technical consultant. Don't worry about writing the stuff down. We'll send out the PDF with you within the next day. And you can contact us on the details here, which is juniper@westcoast.co.uk. If you need anything from us or have any requirements or just want to chat, you can reach out to us at that email address. So this is where we move on to next week as well. So next week's webinar is about Juniper and the hybrid/multi-cloud. So if you want to check that out, that's at the new Westcoast website at westcoast.co.uk and look for the events page, and you'll see it there. So thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you on the 19th at 11 a.m. UK Standard Time. And if you want to tune in to last parts, you can catch that on the Westcoast YouTube channel.